Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host, Pastor S.J. Munson, is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of Christianity. Find them wherever great books are sold. Now, here he is, your host, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Many of us are horrified at the current political landscape. Some of us have even been shocked or exhausted into silence. Back in 2020, that's 4 years ago, after 4 years of Trump, many pundits thought that the next presidential election would be a thorough repudiation of Trumpism and a victory for democracy. Instead, back then, we had a real squeaker, which, while Trump still lost, was close enough to make us scratch our heads and wonder, what is this hold that Donald Trump has over his followers, and why is he so effective at eliciting such loyalty? Our guest back then, Steven Hassan, an expert on cult mind control, had some really provocative answers and some practical advice for dealing with Trump cult followers. I apologize that some of the political references in this interview are now dated, but I think you'll agree that the major points that he makes and the advice he gives are just as pertinent as ever, if not more so. So I hope you will enjoy this rebroadcast of the 2020 interview and perhaps send the link to a friend who needs hope.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. You know, many pundits thought that last week's 2020 presidential election would be a total rout of President Trump. After all, we've spent 4 years of incompetence, chaos, lies and manipulation, inflammatory racist rhetoric, and the most corrupt administration in the nation's history. And surely we thought people would see the mistake and the election would be an overwhelming repudiation of Trumpism. Instead, what we had was a real squeaker. And how is this possible? We're asking. What is this hold that Trump has on his followers? Our guest tonight has some, I think, very helpful answers. He is Steven Hassan, a world-renowned expert on undue influence and cults, mental health professional, speaker, consultant, author, and educator. He's been helping people leave destructive cults since 1976 after he himself was deprogrammed from the Sun Myung Unification Church. He is the founding director of the Freedom of Mind Resource Center. He's authored 4 books, including Combating Cult Mind Control, Freedom of Mind, and The Cult of Trump. Welcome, Steven Hassan. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You know, before we get started talking about Mr. Trump, I think our listeners might be really interested in your personal story. You had been a part of the Moonies. It's called the Moonies for 2.5 years, and you said at the time you felt like you were completely in control of your own faculties, but of course that was not the case. Can you describe your experiences and how did you get free? What was that process like?
Sure. So for me, I was 19 years old and an upper junior at Queens College in New York. In fact, I grew up 1.3 miles from Donald Trump in Queens. My girlfriend had dumped me. I was sitting in the cafeteria and 3 women flirted with me, pretending to be students. And they were a part of a front group of the Moon cult. I even asked them, are you a part of a religious group? They looked me right in the eye and said, no, not at all. And within a few weeks, I was bowing to an altar, believing that the Messiah was a Korean billionaire, and that the last days were imminent. It was told 1977, the end of the world would happen, and God would take control again of the earth, away from Satan. I cut off from my family. I dropped out of college. I threw away my poetry because they wanted me to sacrifice my Isaac, they said. I was promoted in the group. I recruited and indoctrinated people. And 2.5 years later, I fell asleep at the wheel of a fundraising van in Baltimore, Maryland, drove into the back of a tractor-trailer truck at high speed and nearly died. And after several weeks in the hospital and surgery, I called my sister, who had been instructed to not tell where I was because of fear of deprogramming, and she said, "You have a nephew. I want him to know his Uncle Stevie. Please come and visit." And I went, and my sister broke her word to me. I made her promise not to tell my parents because they were satanic, because they said I was in a cult, although I didn't think I was in a cult. I didn't feel brainwashed or mind control. And she did tell them. They hired some ex-Moonies, and I was basically involved with the deprogramming. That lasted 5 days, and at the end of which, after learning about Chinese communist brainwashing and really thinking about my years in the group, I realized Moon was a liar. Therefore, he was untrustworthy. Therefore, he could not be God's agent on earth to bring about world peace. And I cried, and I woke up and felt very ashamed and embarrassed that I had ever believed in the divine principle and Sun Myung Moon, and felt very guilty about all the people I had recruited into the group. And so I had no idea that I'd be doing work related to cults 44 years later, but here I am.
Wow. Story. Thank you for that. And now you've worked for, 40 years now, studying cults and also working with many, many people to help them to deprogram from cults. What is a cult exactly? How would you define it?
Well, I mean, the word has many pejorative meanings as well as kind of punky, folky meanings. Myself, I like to describe an influence continuum from ethical to unethical. And when talking about the word cult, I say that there are ethical cults, benign, where you know what you're getting involved with and you're free to question and you're free to leave, versus destructive authoritarian cults where they make you over in the group's image and where you are controlled through fear and guilt and information, propaganda, and you're made to be obedient and dependent on the group. And over the decades, I became a mental health professional. I've authored 4 books. I'm just finishing a doctoral program. In fact, I have my oral defense next week. And I did my dissertation doing a quantitative study on my BITE model of mind control. BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And in my study, they all came out to be one major factor, control. And then from that moment on, I realized I'm going to call it the BITE model of authoritarian control instead of mind control, because it really fits the definition of authoritarian in that you have blind submission to an authority and you suppress your own ability to think for yourself. So it's very exciting, and my dissertation is really about the legal system and why the law needs to understand undue influence and brainwashing and thought reform. And I connect the dots with federal trafficking laws, coercive persuasion, coercive control, and I provide a model for evaluating any case for whether or not someone has been unduly influenced. So I'm hoping it will help people around the world to better understand how people can be deceived and manipulated and indoctrinated into things they would never normally choose, and how they get stuck in that system and in many ways need help to reevaluate what's happened to them, as I needed help.
Now, the title of your latest book, The Cult of Trump, is certainly a provocative one. When and how did you decide to write this book and effectively just to speak out? Was there a moment that you just said, okay, now I've got to do this, or someone's got to do something?
So I even before he got the Republican nomination to be their candidate, I watched him debating. I watched his declaring a total Muslim ban, and I said, this is a dangerous person who is obviously a narcissist, and that he is going to help Islamic extremists recruit by ordering a Muslim ban. And then I did an interview describing the stereotypical profile of cult leaders, which is malignant narcissism. And from there, I was introduced to a book agent, and he said, I really want you to write a book. And I'm like, yeah, me too. What would you like me to write? He said, The Cult of Trump. And I said, yikes, that's a title that's going to alienate everybody who's a follower of Trump. And he said, yeah, they probably wouldn't read the book anyway, but people need to understand brainwashing and cults and mind control. And would you do it? And I thought about it and discussed it with my wife, and was introduced to the editor at Simon & Schuster, who had done the book on the Nexium cult, had done the book with Omarosa, Unhinged, who was involved with Trump and called it a cult. And I decided to go for it because I had never had a mainstream publisher on that level that was going to put the resources forward. And I nailed the book. I mean, it's a year later, it just came out in paperback, and everything that I've said is completely validated and then some. Unfortunately, people are calling it the cult of Trump, in terms of describing people's blind allegiance to the president. But the book is so much more, and I really hope more people will start to read it now that Biden has been elected president.
Now, I think our listeners need to know this is not a political book. It's not a partisan book. It's more of, as you say, it's a psychological study based on your experience, 40 years in the profession of helping people with come out of cults and studying hundreds and hundreds of cults. You point out in the book some similarities, or many similarities, between the Reverend Moon and Donald Trump. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. It really is a psychology book and not a political attack book or at all. And I try to do different chapters talking about media, talking about propaganda, talking about many things that have led to Donald Trump's election. But chapter 3 of the book, I talk about malignant narcissism. And this is the stereotypical profile of destructive cult leaders. And I'll just read them off briefly. Grandiose, self-centered behavior, fantasies of power, success and attractiveness, need for praise and admiration, sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, which is huge. Then the antisocial behavior, thinking that you're above the law, lying, interpersonally exploitative, sadistic, harassing and silencing of any critics, calls to violence, paranoia, and inability to trust even friends and subordinates. And I compare him with Jim Jones and Sun Myung Moon and Hubbard of Scientology and a number of other destructive cult leaders that I've done work with.
Now, you talk about how cult leaders so often demand absolute loyalty, that they lie, that they present alternative facts, that, as you said, they're grandiose. But you also mentioned fear, and you say, and I'm going to quote from your book, you say, fear defines Trump's philosophy, his personality, and his presidency. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I put fear and guilt under emotional control mechanisms, and essentially, if you want to run a mind control cult, you need to create an enemy. You need to make people so afraid that if they don't follow you and do everything you that you're told to do, that terrible things are going to happen to you. It's going to harm your soul. It's going to hurt the world. And I talk about phobia indoctrination as a man-made technique to make people afraid of thinking for themselves, of asking questions, or of deciding they no longer want to be, involved and a follower. And in my work, I explain to people there are legitimate fears where there's an actual danger versus an irrational fear where there is no danger, but you believe there is. And so to take, for example, the Watchtower organization, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they have a teaching that if you want to get a blood transfusion, you will be doing a grave sin against God, and God will never forgive you, and you'll be excommunicated or disfellowshipped from the cult. And they use Old Testament kosher law verses out of context to justify why people can't get blood transfusions, even though the founder of the Watchtower did not have that teaching. That was a later ad. And there you are with your child who was, hit by a car and is going to die if they don't get a blood transfusion, and you're caught thinking, your conscience and your love for your child to save your child versus the dogma and the indoctrination and the threats of the group that says you can't do it. It's better to let your child die.
Right. Now, in the past, cults have relied on actual physical isolation. You recruit someone, you isolate them from their families, their home context. You feed them with all kinds of new information and lies. But you've seen in the book that cults certainly still do that, but it's no longer really necessary, physical isolation for indoctrination these days. Could you unpack that?
Sure. So, around 1995 or so, the internet became a thing. And ever since, technology has continually advanced to the point now where people have smartphones and they are surrounded by a bubble of platforms and notifications and AI, artificial intelligence, where people can be physically around other people, but they're psychologically isolated from others. And here's where I've been speaking out very consistently from the very beginning of the Trump presidency, which is when the worst thing you can do if you care about someone who's involved with a cult is to yell at them, call them names, tell them they're stupid or they're brainwashed, and cut off contact with them, because the mind controller wants you to cut off contact with the followers, because then it makes it easier for them to control them. And so I've been urging people, if you have family members or friends who are devout Trump supporters, to stay in touch, to even avoid talking politics, but stay connected, and tell them you love them, tell them you care about them, pray for them, and engage them in conversations about other cult situations. With people involved with the Trump cult, they will happily talk to you about Chinese communist brainwashing techniques, and so I have a chance to talk to them about all of the military intelligence research that was done in the 1950s after the Korean War, especially. And so you can teach them about brainwashing and mind control indirectly, or about pimps or traffickers, and how they groom victims and indoctrinate them, give them a new identity and new language, new clothing, etc., to make them slaves to make money for them. So talking indirectly about what is a cult and what is mind control without attacking Trump directly or attacking the ideology is the way to engage in a ethical conversation. And I always recommend to have an open mind to the extent that you're willing to hear other points of view. And if you watch Fox or if you listen to talk radio or Alex Jones or Rush Limbaugh, you can understand why people believe what they believe, because it is information that's not fact-based and is not grounded in testable reality. Mm-hmm. So I say deep down inside, I believe in God. I believe that God wants us to think for ourselves and make decisions and choices. I often, with the Abrahamic faiths, talk about how if Almighty God didn't brainwash Adam and Eve to be obedient and dependent, how could any group today saying that they're doing God's will justify deceptive recruitment, where there's lack of informed consent? How could any group justify, blind obedience?
We have, my wife and I have a family member, and recently we were at a get-together, and I normally, I know there's people on different ends of the spectrum in our extended family, and we try not to bring things up unless someone wants to talk about something. We don't want to, turn a family gathering into the Battle of the Bulge. However, I slipped and I said something, without mentioning Trump by name, I said something kind of derogatory about our government and things that were going on in the nation, how disappointed I was. And there's one person in our family who's normally just the sweetest person, so loving and generous, all of a sudden just exploded all over me. And it was like I was at the other end of a fire hose of Fox News talking points. Her personality changed really violently, and it was frightening, really. And after, I knew I wasn't going to probably get through to her and be able to challenge her on all these points, so I just said at the end of it, I looked her in the eyes and very lovingly said, "Do you really believe all that?" Well, that probably wasn't the right thing to say either, but it didn't go anywhere, so we just stopped. And I think of, Thanksgiving is coming up, and it probably won't be a traditional Thanksgiving for a lot of people. Like my family, we're probably just going to have Thanksgiving by ourselves, but a lot of people will be traveling, going to family reunions and seeing, Uncle George and Aunt Harriet. And, what would you recommend? What would be the first step to trying to help people get free of this?
Yeah, so obviously I'm a believer in science, and I think that people should wear masks if they're getting together socially and try to be outdoors if the weather permits, because it's a lot safer than being in an indoor space, and, wash your hands all the time. But, what I would have said, if I was going to coach you about what to say, I would say something like, I see that you're really passionate, in all of these things. I'm curious, when did you start believing this? Or where did you first hear these ideas? Because I've known you for a long time, and these are new things. And try to get the person to think back to who they were prior to getting involved with this black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, totalistic, authoritarian, mentality. Get them back in time and kind of walk you through the process of how they shifted their mind. And with Trump, asking people, what's your first memory of Trump? They'll often say, I saw him on The Apprentice, what a jerk. I saw him, I read a tabloid and he was, having an affair when he was still married, or something like that. And help them remember that they had a critical point of view. And now they're a fanatical supporter what happened to make these changes, and to what extent do you want to consider the possibility that maybe it's the things that they're believing are either not true or have an alternate explanation for it. So, for example, with QAnon, which has gained millions of believers around the world in 80 countries, it was a alternate reality game to start with, and it is now demonstrated that it's really a psyop, a psychological operation of state actors and authoritarian cults that are trying to stir up trouble, to create conflict, to create civil war in the United States, and that the people involved with it have very nefarious histories, the opposite of what true believers think, that it's this wonderful organization that's going to fight the satanic cabal of traffickers and such.
Right.
So the reality is that we live not in a post-truth world. We live in the age of influence, and truth is still truth, and anything that is legitimate will stand up to scrutiny and will invite questions and reality testing. And I think it's always a good idea to be humble and not assume you know the truth with a capital T. And if you are a believer, as I am in God, to be humble and to put the belief in the Almighty, and that love is the strongest force, not hatred or fear, and that we're all living together on this beautiful planet, and we are our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper, and
right.
and we are stewards of creation and need to take care of it properly.
Right.
So, I think there are going to be millions of people kind of coming out of a trance, especially if Trump is arrested when he's no longer in the White House, especially as more facts come out about the criminal activities and behaviors that I suspect he is guilty of. And I really do hope that more former cult members like myself, who've actually experienced being in a group like this, start speaking out. In fact, we've started a hashtag movement called I Got Out, to kind of hopefully build on the Me Too movement of women who are saying, yep, I got sexually assaulted too, to say, yep, I'm smart, I'm educated, but it happened to me, and to try to create a big exit ramp for people who've been in all kinds of different authoritarian cults to start reality testing and ask themselves, do I really want to continue to be involved with what I'm involved with right now? And if the answer is no, then move on and get support.
I imagine if Trump leaves office in a constitutional manner, and if this election gets sorted out constitutionally, as we hope, Trump leaves office and no longer has all the airwaves that he had before, all the national attention. I'm assuming that will help, bring people, kind of help to break the spell, at least for some people, because they're not getting the constantly being fed that information. Of course, there's others, I guess, that will take his place, and his, he has servants everywhere. What do you think, or what are you hopeful for in terms of that future?
I think his power comes from having the office of the presidency, honestly. Everyone who's worked for him in a business capacity has, many people have spoken out that he's a horrible person to be around. He's a very abusive, very transactional, wants blind loyalty. And So I don't see a large group, idolizing him. I think there are a lot of religious authority figures, people who are part of Christian nationalism, dominionism, people who say God is using Trump. It's those people's control over their followers. The minute they stop saying God's using Trump and direct their members elsewhere, then they won't be following Trump at all.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm a retired pastor, and I'm no longer pastoring, but my wife and I have had difficulty over the past several years finding a church, and we just think we get settled in, this is a nice church, we like it, we like the pastor, we like the people, the teaching is good here, and then the pastor will say something from the pulpit. We realize he's not dealing with reality, and we've had, pastors say that, Trump is a kind of modern-day Nebuchadnezzar who's God's going to use to lead the church, into freedom and blah, blah, blah. And we've confronted pastors about this. We've written letters without response. And eventually we just say, we're going to have to leave. This is not a place that I feel safe in. What is happening with the church, and what can we do as Christians to help bring the church back into reality?
So I think it really comes back to people like yourself not cowering, but actually talking about the gospel and talking about quoting Jesus, as you do to the least in my kingdom, you do to me, instead of, saying, oh, elitism works and who cares if people are starving and dying. Let's give, more tax cuts to the super wealthy corporations. To go back to love, to go back to praying in your closet versus, these loud, audible prayers where they're telling God what to do, or where they're chanting in a mind control-ish way. I really come back to modeling, good Christians, Jews, Muslims, walking the walk and being humble, but not being silent, and reaching out to people and saying, here's my understanding of what God wants for us, and the great commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul, and love others as you love yourself. That's not about, calling names and making people fearful and paranoid and whipping people up to violence against fellow Americans. That's evil.
In chapter 4 of your book, in fact, the title of the chapter is America, a Country Wired for Manipulation. Could you talk about what do you mean by that? How are we wired for manipulation?
Yeah, so, the point that chapter is that we've really undergone this huge evolution of knowledge about how to influence minds and how to get people to buy things they don't know or don't care or don't need, how to get people to vote for people that they don't know and don't like. And I talk about Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who was the first person to put psychology together with politics and the first person to use psychology in business in a formal marketing sense. He wrote a book in 1928 called Propaganda. I might add Hitler and Goebbels used Bernays' work of how to manipulate and get people to buy things and do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And over time, this has just gotten more and more sophisticated. In the meantime, rules that were put in place to make sure that media was being responsible and had obligations to the public good those laws got lifted or voted out, and entertainment, was allowed, which included exploiting the freedom of speech to the point where people were putting out propaganda and disinformation, making it sound like it's news when it's not news. And instead of having a kind of scientific error detection and correction system in journalism and the media, it started becoming about money. How much money could a network make? And it turned out that, doom and gloom would sell more papers or magazines or would get more people watching. And it goes on from there, where with cell phones and the digital age, so much of our personal data has been collected nefariously and is being sold to third parties in order to know how to manipulate us online to get us to do things that we wouldn't do or buy things we wouldn't need or want to buy. And so we're at a point now in the 21st century where citizens need to get educated about all these techniques that are being used on them. Otherwise, we're just going to, whoever has the bully pit and has a lot of billionaires running the media, we're going to be in trouble with thinking for ourselves. I think, honestly, I've been on so many television shows over the decades, and over time I've been experiencing more and more where producers would say, we can't do that story. Oh, why not? We don't want to get sued. Yeah, but everything that we would say is, proven. Yeah, but we would lose money if we have to deal with a lawsuit. So we're not going to cover that. And, we need a free and independent media to help us navigate and be good citizens. And that's one of the points I made in the last chapter of The Cult of Trump, that I feel like we need to have a funded, independent journalism entity that its sole mission is to protect the public versus, other media that needs to satisfy their corporate sponsors or needs to satisfy, advertisers.
Right. I was reading an article recently, just after the election, that said, this election is not really about the economy. It's not really even about COVID. It's about radio. It's about radio and the power of radio, talk radio in the more rural sections of the country, places where for the past 30 years Rush Limbaugh has had people's ears, and people who live in the big cities where there's just more variety, of choices on radio, if they listen to radio at all, are totally unaware of that and don't understand that. Can you describe what's been going on there?
No, I think that we're information beings, right? We have five senses, and we, navigate our lives based on the information that we're exposed to. It tells us what the weather is. It tells us what the economy is doing. It tells us, everything. And there's a phenomenon known as highway hypnosis that is a recognized phenomenon. And if you think about it, if you're driving long distances, it's a very common thing to kind of wake up and go, where was I the last 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Or where was I the last 10 miles? Well, if you have the radio on and they're doing talk radio, a lot of that goes into your unconscious without you analyzing any of that. And if you listen for hour after hour after hour, you start taking it seriously. Otherwise, you would turn it off or you would change the station, right? There's a documentary movie that I saw a few years ago called The Brainwashing of My Dad by Jen Cinco, and her father became radicalized. He became a racist, and he started from listening to talk radio and then gravitated upwards to Fox. And it was only when he got ill and didn't have access to the radio or the TV set for a few weeks, he became normal again. And
so unplugging
literally,
is a powerful thing.
Yeah, it really is. And, everybody needs to step back and say, what kind of world do we want to live in? What, are we happy and satisfied with the quality of the relationships we're having with important people in our lives? And if the answer is no, we need to make some changes. And part of that is learning to turn off notifications. Part of it is turning the phone off altogether. Spending time playing games, having real conversations about things that are meaningful. And here's another very important point, to deliberately seek out others who have different beliefs than you, perhaps even different religious beliefs than you, because it's an opportunity to learn and expand and to just develop as a human being.
And we have hopefully a new president coming on the way.
Well, we have a new president. Trump is
sorry?
not acknowledging it, but we have a new president. NATO has, all the leaders of NATO have congratulated Biden. I think Erdogan of Turkey was the exception, and maybe Melania's country of birth was the second exception. But everyone else understands that the election is over and Trump lost, except for Trump, and who wants to try to bend reality to his way. And he knows that he's in a lot of trouble. He owes over $400 million to, we think, foreign sources. And he's got endless lawsuits and criminal suits waiting for him. So he's going to fight. He's not going to go easily, and he's going to try to distract. And he's fired Mark Esper, head of the defense. I think it's DIA that he's the head of, and because Esper was like being a good patriot and wanting to do the normal transfer of power things. Biden is supposed to be getting intelligence briefings from this day forward, and he's not going to get them until the votes are certified, which I believe is December 1st. And then he still may not get them. And it really depends on, I think, patriots who are still in the government saying no to Trump.
Right.
No, we're going to do the right thing. You're not the president anymore. Till, January 20th, Biden will be sworn in. But
if you were sitting down with President-elect Biden and had his ear, obviously the country's been through a really difficult time, but we're looking at tens of millions, if not 100 million people who have been under the influence and still under the influence of Donald Trump. How can we deal with that on a national level, or is there a way to deal with that on the national level? We talked about how to approach someone on a personal, relational level. Well, what about the national level? Is there a way to deal with that? What are things that we can do? What are the options, or are there any?
Well, so it's an interesting and important question. We need to start by having people understand what we mean by destructive authoritarian cultism and the mechanisms in it. And that's, what my work is about. So I would want to explain the influence continuum. By the way, this is on my website, freedomofmind.com, if anyone wants to see the graphics on this continuum and the BITE model. And to basically begin an education program with everyone to understand the differences between ethical and unethical influence. So, for example, talking about religion, since you're a retired pastor, it's appropriate. Like a legitimate religion tells people they're trying to convert up front who they are, what they believe, And what's going to happen if you decide to join the church or join the temple or whatever? So people have what's called informed consent, that they have that knowledge of knowing what they're getting involved with. Destructive mind controllers want to lie, not only overt lies, but they want to withhold vital information, and they also want to distort information to make it more palatable. And in my opinion, when I was approached by those women, by the Moonies, and I asked if they were part of a religious group, and they said no, not at all, they were infringing on my religious freedom as a Jew. And so for me, any legitimate religious organization that is systematically deceiving people to get them into the group, this is a problem.
Yeah.
So for example, the Watchtower, I'm going to mention them again, they go door to door, they knock on doors, they say, we want to study the Bible with you, but they never disclose to people we're using the New World Translation that was done,
right.
that no scholars say is accurate, you know, but people are deceived into thinking they're studying the actual Bible.
I mean, it's a leather-bound book, you know, it has gold lettering on it, right?
If you join, you're going to be prohibited from having a blood transfusion, or you're going to be possibly kicked out, and your family and friends will not be able to talk to you if you decide you want to send a birthday card to a non-member.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these things should be disclosed. So, but we can get into the government. The government has never said, a responsible representative of the U.S. government has never said to the public that mind control even exists. You know, there's knowledge that the CIA did MK Ultra, that they did Operation Mockingbird and Paperclip and these other covert operations that a lot of Trumpers and QAnon people correctly cite as an abuse of power. I think they're going to need to own up and say, yep, actually people can be hypnotized without them realizing it. People can be indoctrinated into a new belief system. And here's how to protect yourself. And here's how to help somebody who's been harmed. What's so positive right now is that there's so much interest in the media, so many documentaries being done about different cult groups. So people are getting educated through watching a number of these documentaries about the fact that intelligent, educated people can be deceived and indoctrinated and do really horrible things to their psyches and to others. I really believe we need to be aspirational at this point instead of worrying about fanatical Trump followers. I think we need to keep our eyes on the Constitution and the rule of law, and that it's called the United States and not, you know, creating a North and a South that's going to be in armed combat with each other.
Right. Well, Steven Hassan, we're out of time, and thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. Steven Hassan's book, Cult of Trump, and the other books are also, titles are posted on our website, and they're available through, I assume, Amazon.com and other big booksellers. And
yep.
We will post also your website, which is, what the name of your site again is?
freedomofmind.com.
freedomofmind.com. Okay,
Yeah.
We'll have that posted on our website as well. Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much. And everybody needs to just have hope and move forward.
And God bless you for your important work. And for you out there, thank you for listening. And this is Reverend S.J. Munson signing out.